Hello, friends. Today we will journey into the past, so you can relax and learn something new before sleep. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because by the end of our story, you might be peacefully asleep. Imagine France in the 15th century. A country exhausted by endless wars, suffering from famine and epidemics. Cities are engulfed in flames, entire regions are captured by enemies, and the people have almost lost faith in salvation. In this grim period, an astonishing figure steps onto the stage of history, Joan d'Arc. A young peasant girl from a small village, unable to read or write at the age of 17, claims that saints are commanding her to liberate France. Nearly 600 years have passed, yet her story continues to inspire people all over the world. Joan d'Arc became a symbol of courage, faith, and self-sacrifice. But who was she really? How did a simple girl manage to lead an army, inspire monarchs, and change the course of a war? In this story, we will try to understand her personality. Was she a saint, guided by divine power? Or was she used in a complex political game by kings and clergy? Were her visions true revelations or the result of deep faith and stress? Why, centuries later, does she remain one of history's most enigmatic figures? Let us embark on this journey to uncover the mysteries of Joan d'Arc. To understand the scale of her feat, let us picture the era in which she lived. 15th century France was the scene of a bloody conflict known as the 100 Years' War. It lasted from 1337 to 1453, that is 116 years, and became one of the most devastating events of the Middle Ages. The conflict began over a dispute for the French throne. In 1328, King Charles IV died without leaving any sons. This caused a political crisis. The English king, Edward III, grandson of Philip IV through the female line, declared his claim. The French nobility, citing Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through women, rejected his claims. As a result, a representative of the new Valois dynasty, Philip VI, nephew of the previous king, was elected to the French throne. Edward III, not recognizing this decision, perceived it as a personal insult and a violation of his legitimate rights. In 1337, he officially declared war on France, thereby initiating a long and tragic conflict. Initially, success was on the side of the English. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, English troops under the command of Edward III inflicted a heavy defeat on the numerically far superior French army. The English achieved victory thanks to the skill of their archers, armed with longbows, whose arrows easily pierced French armor. This battle went down in history as one of England's most famous victories and revealed the full weakness of traditional French military strategy. 10 years later, in 1356, another tragic battle for the French occurred, the Battle of Poitiers. Here, Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, again defeated the French army and even captured the French king himself, John II the Good. The king was taken to England, which became a huge humiliation for all of France. The country plunged into anarchy. Peasant and burgher uprisings began, and agriculture and the economy fell into decline. The war continued with varying success and was interrupted by several truces, however. A decisive blow was dealt to France in 1415, when the young English king, Henry V, landed in northern France and engaged in the famous Battle of Agincourt. Despite the numerical superiority of the French, the English again routed the enemy thanks to more competent tactics and discipline. After this defeat, the French were morally broken, the English captured Paris and a large part of northern France. By this time, France was on the verge of ceasing to exist as an independent state. Powerful provinces, such as Burgundy, began to act independently, often forming alliances with the English against the central French authority. King Charles VI, the Mad, had effectively lost power due to illness and mental disorder, and the country found itself in complete political chaos. Against the backdrop of these catastrophic events, the common people of France endured immense suffering. Constant wars destroyed harvests, caused epidemics and famine. Many peasants and townspeople lost their homes and livelihoods, forced to wander and beg. Poverty, disease, and constant fear became an integral part of French life. Far from the major cities, amidst the boundless meadows, forests, and hills of Lorraine, lay the small village of Domremy, almost untouched by civilization and the noise of the outside world. Here, people's lives were governed by natural cycles and the daily routine of rural labor. Not much different from that of 100 or even 200 years before. It was here, in a simple peasant family, in the year 1412, that a girl named Jeanne was born. Her family, whose surname the whole world would later come to know as d'Arc, did not stand out among their fellow villagers, but was respected for its honesty and diligence. Jeanne's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of stern disposition, straightforward, strict, but fair. He cultivated a small plot of land, grew grain, raised livestock, managed the farm, and was sometimes elected village elder. Jacques strove to raise his children in a spirit of discipline, respect for labor, and strict moral principles. In his house, there was no place for idleness or laziness. He did not tolerate sloth and always ensured that his children were occupied with useful tasks. Jeanne's mother, Isabelle Romée, was the complete opposite of her husband, a gentle, kind, warm-hearted, and deeply religious woman. It was she who, from a very early age, taught Jeanne and her brothers and sister to pray, told them biblical stories, and raised them in a spirit of compassion and mercy towards their neighbors. Isabelle was not only the keeper of the hearth, but also the family's spiritual guide. Thanks to her, the children grew up in an atmosphere of kindness, love, and faith, learning patience and compassion, which were so necessary in those difficult times. Jeanne, being the fourth child, grew up surrounded by her brothers and sister, participating daily in all family chores and tasks. From an early age, she helped her mother prepare food, clean the house, wash clothes, and care for the animals. When the girl grew older, her father entrusted her with more demanding work, tending to livestock, harvesting crops, and helping with field work. All this accustomed Jeanne to hard physical labor and responsibility. Even from childhood, neighbors noticed her unusual seriousness, deep thoughtfulness, and surprising independence, especially for her age. Jeanne never complained about hardships and did not shirk work, always showing remarkable maturity and diligence. Unlike her peers who, after hard days of labor, gladly spent time socializing, playing games, and dancing, Jeanne preferred silence and solitude. She often went beyond the village outskirts, where she would sit alone for long periods in thought or prayer. This set her apart from the other inhabitants of Domremy, and made her a subject of attention and wonder among the neighbors, who saw in her not just an unusual girl, but a person with a special inner world, full of deep thoughts not entirely understood by them. Thus, the environment of the small village, the harshness of daily life, her father's simple but firm morality, and her mother's gentle religiosity laid the foundations of Jeanne d'Arc's character and worldview. It was in this simple, even seemingly primitive, rural setting that the girl who was destined one day to lead an army and inspire an entire nation to fight for its independence grew and strengthened. When Jeanne was about 13 years old, her life suddenly changed in the most unexpected way. One day, while she was in the garden at her home, the girl heard mysterious voices for the first time. This event became a turning point in her destiny. Although at first, Jeanne dared not tell anyone about it, fearing misunderstanding and ridicule. According to Jeanne's own accounts, the first to appear to her were Archangel Michael and Saints Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch. They appeared before her as bright, luminous figures surrounded by a heavenly radiance. The voices of the saints were gentle, yet insistent and clear. They spoke to her simply and understandably, urging her to be devout, virtuous, and always to follow God's will. But the most astonishing thing was that, after some time, they informed her of her great mission to liberate France from the English and to help the rightful French king be crowned in the city of Reims. These visions recurred regularly, sometimes several times a week. Jeanne perceived them not as hallucinations or dreams, but as entirely real events. She felt chosen, yet at the same time, she was bewildered and even frightened by the immense responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon her shoulders. At first, Jeanne kept her vision secret. However, gradually her behavior began to change, and those around her could not help but notice. If before she had been merely a quiet, serious girl, now she became even more withdrawn and pensive. She would disappear for long periods, going into the forest or to the small village chapel, where she spent much time in prayer and reflection. Her family and neighbors initially regarded the changes in Jeanne's behavior with caution, but also with patience, believing them to be age-related peculiarities or a manifestation of excessive piety. However, over time, her behavior began to cause serious concern and sometimes outright bewilderment. People started saying she was strange and not like everyone else. Some fellow villagers even believed that Jeanne was under the influence of evil spirits or witchcraft. Rumors began to circulate in the village that the girl had lost her mind and should not be trusted. The family's reaction was particularly difficult. Her father, a stern, down-to-earth man, was deeply troubled by his daughter's behavior, considering her actions and words to be manifestations of dangerous pride or illness. He even said he would rather drown her with his own hands than allow his daughter to disgrace the family and the village. Jeanne's mother, Isabel, though troubled by her daughter's behavior, nevertheless showed more understanding and sympathy, sensing that her daughter was experiencing something very important, even sacred. Nonetheless, despite the difficult reactions from her family and neighbors, Jeanne never wavered in her convictions. She continued to assert that the voices of the saints were real, that it was not a dream or an illness, and that she was prepared to do anything to fulfill her destiny. It was this absolute faith in her mission and her ability to withstand the pressure from those around her that distinguished Jeanne from thousands of other village girls and laid the foundation for her incredible destiny, which was soon to shake all of France and change history forever. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church's attitude towards mystical revelations and visions was quite complex and ambiguous. On the one hand, the Church recognized the possibility of divine revelation and actively supported the cult of saints, many of whom claimed to receive revelations and prophecies directly from God or saints. Figures like Saint Catherine of Siena or Saint Bridget of Sweden were considered respected and worthy of veneration, despite their unusual spiritual experiences. On the other hand, the Church feared the spread of false prophets and heresies that could undermine its authority or lead the faithful astray. Any mystical revelation at that time was carefully scrutinized and controlled by ecclesiastical authorities. Usually confessors or theologians would study the claims of people reporting visions to determine their authenticity. A person recounting mystical revelations had to display profound humility, complete submission to the church, and demonstrate exceptional spiritual purity. If, however, visions were accompanied by signs of pride, disobedience to spiritual authorities, or questionable moral conduct, such individuals were quickly declared either possessed by demons, charlatans, or simply insane. When Jeanne first spoke of her visions, many residents of Dom Remy and local priests regarded her with great skepticism. However, there were several reasons why she was not immediately declared insane or a heretic. Firstly, Jeanne's behavior was impeccable from the standpoint of Christian moral norms. She was pious, modest, kind-hearted, prayed regularly, and sincerely followed all religious canons. She did not seek fame, did not demand attention for herself, and showed no signs of pride, which usually aroused the church's suspicion. Secondly, Jeanne spoke of her visions calmly, clearly, and very convincingly. Her words were logical and lucid, unlike the incoherent rambling of madmen or charlatans who were easily exposed. She recounted the details of her revelations so plausibly and consistently that even experienced confessors could not immediately dismiss her words. Furthermore, the historical context played a significant role. France was in a catastrophic situation, and the people desperately awaited a miracle. The church could not ignore the mood of society, especially when common people began to see in Jeanne a possible savior sent by God. The local priests themselves, and even some members of the higher clergy, secretly hoped that Jeanne's visions would prove genuine and help the country find peace and stability. And finally, the church and secular authorities saw in Jeanne a potential political instrument that could be used to strengthen the king's authority and unite the people against a foreign enemy. Had she been immediately declared insane or possessed, the opportunity to use her influence and authority among the common people would have been lost. That is why, instead of condemning Jeanne outright, they decided to examine her thoroughly, sending her for discussions with theologians and learned clergymen. She was subjected to rigorous interrogations, tests of sincerity, and moral purity. When it turned out that Jeanne successfully passed all these tests and gave clear and convincing answers, her mission was deemed worthy of attention, allowing her to go to the king. Thus, the church's attitude towards Jeanne and her revelations was cautious but favorable. As a result of a thorough analysis and examination of her behavior and beliefs, instead of accusing her of madness or heresy, the ecclesiastical authorities effectively approved her mission, giving Jeanne the opportunity to become the figure who changed the course of French history. When Jeanne became fully convinced that her calling was to liberate France and lead the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII, to his coronation, she realized that the only way to fulfill this mission was to go to him in person. This was an incredibly audacious and risky undertaking. A simple peasant girl, barely out of childhood, intended to meet personally with the highest representative of the country's authority, the future king. Jeanne was full of determination. She set off for the nearest fortified town, Vaucouleurs, where Captain Robert de Baudricourt, known for his stern character and rational thinking, was stationed. He was a practical, pragmatic, and extremely cautious man, and at first he treated Jeanne with great skepticism and even derision. Indeed, from the perspective of any sensible person of that time, the idea of a young peasant girl claiming to be sent by God to save France seemed insane and absurd. However, Jeanne was persistent and had no intention of giving up. She began to visit Robert de Baudricourt regularly, repeating her requests and confidently stating that she needed to meet the Dauphin. Despite his initial refusal, the girl stubbornly returned again and again, convincing him that she was truly sent by God. Her absolute confidence, simplicity, and seriousness gradually began to impress the captain. Meanwhile, rumors about the strange peasant girl and her mission began to spread throughout Vaucouleurs and its surroundings. The common people, desperately awaiting some kind of miracle, began to support Jeanne, and some even saw her appearance as a sign from God. This public pressure and the faith of the people also played an important role in Robert de Baudricourt's decision. The final decision came after Jeanne made a bold and unexpected prophecy. She informed the captain of a major French military defeat near Orléans, news of which had not yet reached Vaucouleurs. A few days later, this news was indeed confirmed, shocking de Baudricourt and forcing him to seriously consider Jeanne's words. Now, surprised and bewildered, Robert de Baudricourt decided that if Jeanne truly possessed such a gift, perhaps it was worth giving her a chance. He agreed to send her to Chinon, where Charles VII was residing, but he set a condition. Jeanne was to travel under reliable guard and dressed in men's clothing for safety, to avoid attention and possible attacks on the road. Thus began her legendary journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon. Accompanied by a small group of soldiers and attendants, Jeanne set out on a path full of dangers and unknowns. Despite the fear of bandits, English and Burgundian soldiers, the girl was calm and confident, convinced that God would protect her on this journey. After several days of arduous travel, bypassing hostile territories and avoiding confrontations, Jeanne arrived in Chinon, where the Dauphin was. It was here that she was to face her most important test and prove to the future king that God himself had sent her to save France. When Jeanne d'Arc arrived in Chinon, the town and the palace were already filled with rumors about an unusual peasant girl who claimed she was destined to save France. Her arrival was met with curiosity mixed with skepticism and even distrust. Some saw her as the country's last hope, while others considered her merely a young fantasist, or worse, a cunning tool of their enemies. For Charles VII himself, the situation was particularly delicate. At that time, he was not yet a crowned king and did not even control most of France. His authority was unstable and surrounded by constant threats and intrigues. The Dauphin Charles was experiencing agonizing doubts and feared conspiracies, which made him extremely cautious and distrustful of any new allies, especially one as unusual as an illiterate peasant girl who claimed that saints and archangels appeared to her. That is why Charles VII and his advisors decided to arrange a special test to determine the truth of Jeanne's intentions. On the evening of the 6th of March, 1429, when Jeanne was invited to meet the Dauphin, the palace was full of aristocrats, courtiers, and soldiers. Instead of sitting in his usual place on the dais in the richly decorated throne room and dressed in royal robes, Charles hid among his courtiers. He was dressed in simple, noble attire and did not stand out among the many other men surrounding him. Moreover, one of his close noblemen, specially dressed in royal garments, was seated in the Dauphin's place of honor to mislead Jeanne. This test was a serious and cunning move. If Jeanne had made a mistake and taken another man for the king, she could have been immediately sent back to her village, declared either insane or an impostor. Charles VII and his entourage wanted to ascertain whether the girl was truly endowed with some unusual knowledge or gift that would allow her to unerringly recognize the real king. When Jeanne entered the castle hall, crowded with people, she showed neither confusion nor hesitation. Paying no attention to the one seated on the throne and passing him by with complete confidence, Jeanne headed straight into the center of the crowd, precisely to the spot where the disguised Dauphin Charles stood. Then she humbly and confidently knelt before him and uttered words that astonished all present. "In the name of the Lord God, you are the true heir of France and the future king. It is you whom I must lead to Rheims for the sacred coronation." According to eyewitness accounts, the Dauphin was astonished, though he tried not to show it. He asked Jeanne how she had managed to recognize him among the multitude of courtiers, to which she replied that she was guided by God's will and the instructions of the voices of saints. According to contemporary testimonies, Jeanne also told Charles something very personal and secret known only to him, which finally convinced the Dauphin that before him was not an ordinary girl, but a person with a special mission. A curious historical fact is why Charles VII decided on such an unusual test at all. The reason was not only his personal doubts and fears, but also the tense atmosphere of court intrigues. By this time, many influential courtiers distrusted the Dauphin and were trying to discredit him. Charles understood that the appearance of a figure like Jeanne could be both a strong argument in his favor and a trap set by his enemies. By testing her in this way, he could simultaneously ascertain her authenticity and demonstrate to his courtiers and opponents that he was acting with caution and reason. The success of this test became a turning point not only for Jeanne herself, but for all of France. From that day on, she was officially recognized as a person sent by God, capable of turning the tide of the war. Now, nothing prevented her from undertaking her great mission and leading the French army to the liberation of Orléans and the subsequent coronation of Charles VII in Reims. From the beginning of 1429, Orléans became the true heart of French resistance, the last bastion holding northern France from complete English capture. Strategically located on the banks of the Loire, Orléans played a decisive role for both sides. For the English, capturing Orléans meant the possibility of unimpeded invasion into central France, continuing the offensive southward, practically guaranteeing full control over the country. For the French, Orléans was the final wall separating them from ultimate defeat. The city had been besieged by the English since October of 1428. English troops, under the command of experienced military leaders such as the Earl of Salisbury and later William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, had surrounded Orléans with powerful fortifications and bastions, completely cutting off access to the city. The English tactic was simple and brutal to starve the city into submission by cutting off its supplies of food and reinforcements. The garrison and inhabitants resisted desperately, but gradually their strength waned. Supplies of water and food were running out, and diseases caused by unsanitary conditions and lack of food began to spread among the population. Inside the city walls, an atmosphere of ever-increasing despair prevailed. Although the defenders tried to maintain fortitude and courage, panic and despondency inevitably spread among the inhabitants. People ate whatever they could. Grain became a rarity. Meat had almost completely disappeared. They had to use anything they could find, including roots and herbs. The soldiers of Orléans, growing weaker day by day, nevertheless repelled English attacks and sorties daily. The city's fortifications held on by a thread and the spirit of its defenders. The English felt so confident that they openly mocked the city's defenders. Right under the walls of Orléans, they held feasts, loudly celebrated their victories, jeered, and conducted nightly tournaments. These actions were psychological warfare, aimed at breaking the spirit of the defenders and hastening their surrender. The situation in Orléans was so dire that many of Charles VII's advisors considered the city practically lost. In the Dauphin's entourage, heated debates raged on whether to try to save the city or to abandon it and conserve resources and troops for the defense of southern territories. The Dauphin Charles VII himself was in a state of indecision and doubt, understanding that the loss of Orléans would definitively discredit him in the eyes of the people and completely destroy the morale of the French. Meanwhile, the people of France, following the siege of Orléans, were in a state of despair and helplessness. The city had become not just a military objective, but a symbol of resistance against the invaders. If Orleans fell, it would mean the spiritual collapse of the entire country. Inhabitants of other cities, witnessing the powerlessness of the French army and king, might easily capitulate without a fight. The English understood this perfectly, which is why they so persistently strove to capture the city. At this critical moment for the French, the arrival of Jeanne d'Arc was a completely unexpected turn of fate. The very idea that a frail peasant girl could influence the outcome of the war seemed absurd and incredible in those days. But it was precisely because of this absurdity and Jeanne's own exceptional faith that her appearance made a stunning impression on French society and the army. News that Jeanne, God's messenger, as the common people began to call her, was moving towards the city spread instantly among the defenders and inhabitants of Orleans. The hungry, exhausted, and despairing people once again felt hope, saw a sign that God had not abandoned them. This return of faith became arguably more powerful a weapon than any troops or war machines. Thus, by the beginning of 1429, Orleans was not just a key strategic point on the map of the 100 Years' War, but also the place where the fate of an entire nation was being decided. The city was on the brink of an abyss, and its fall would have meant the collapse of all France. It was in this final minute of despair that Jeanne d'Arc appeared, the woman who was destined to change the course of history and inspire not only the soldiers of Orleans, but all of France to fight. When Jeanne d'Arc entered Orleans on the 29th of April, 1429, the city had already been under a most severe siege by English troops for about 7 months. The defenders of Orleans were utterly exhausted by constant battles, hunger, and disease. The English detachment, numbering about 5,000 men, under the command of such experienced military leaders as William de la Pole and John Talbot, were confident of their victory. They controlled almost all approaches to the city and had erected an entire system of powerful fortifications and bastions around Orleans, practically cutting it off completely from the outside world. The French themselves understood that without a miracle, the city was doomed. The morale of Orleans' defenders was extremely low. At this dramatic moment, the arrival of a young peasant girl with no military experience seemed practically absurd. But Jeanne's appearance became precisely the miracle that the inhabitants and soldiers had hoped for. Her words were simple and convincing. God sent me to save the city. The soldiers, weary of endless defeats and deaths, felt that in Jeanne, hope for deliverance had come to them. One of Jeanne's first actions in Orleans was to meet with the commanders of the defense. Among them were experienced military leaders such as Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, the famous Captain La Hire, Marshal Gilles de Rais, and others. Despite their initial skepticism, they were struck by the girl's determination and confidence. She immediately demanded an end to defensive tactics and a shift to an offensive against the English, which completely contradicted the cautious advice of the commanders. Her insistence and passionate conviction made such an impression that the military leaders soon agreed to trust her. Jeanne was always at the very center of battles, but an interesting fact is that she never once fought with a weapon in her hand. Her sword, obtained at her request from the Church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, was more a symbol than an actual combat tool. According to historical testimonies, Jeanne never used it, preferring instead to carry a battle standard. On this white banner, embroidered with golden lilies, the symbols of France, were the names Jesus and Mary. Jeanne believed her destiny was not to kill enemies, but to inspire soldiers with her faith, courage, and spiritual strength. During battles, Jean was in the most dangerous sectors, waving her standard and encouraging the soldiers with her voice, an example of personal courage. Soldiers recounted that her fearlessness and selflessness inspired them to feats they previously could not even have imagined. Once during an assault on English fortifications, Jeanne was seriously wounded by an arrow in the shoulder. However, after receiving first aid, she rose to her feet again and continued to inspire the warriors for further attacks. The most decisive event during the siege was the battle for Les Tourelles, a powerful English bastion on the banks of the Loire, considered virtually impregnable. On the 7th of May, 1429, Jeanne personally led the decisive assault. The French soldiers, previously demoralized and convinced of inevitable defeat, now charged the enemy fortifications with extraordinary courage and desperation. The English were so stunned and bewildered by the sudden French ferocity that they failed to hold their positions. Les Tourelles fell, and with it the English confidence that the city would soon surrender also collapsed. The next day, the 8th of May, 1429, the English army, having completely lost initiative and morale, was forced to lift the siege and retreat. For all of France, this victory was a tremendous event, the first major French victory in many years of war. The people immediately named Jeanne the Maid of Orleans, and her fame began to spread throughout the country. The victory at Orleans became a turning point in the entire Hundred Years' War and restored the French people's faith in the possibility of liberating the country from English occupation. After the victory at Orleans, Jeanne was surrounded by universal respect and veneration. But her style of conduct in battles remained the same. She never participated in bloodshed and never killed personally. She maintained her role as a spiritual leader, a person whose strength lay in faith and example, and whose banner became a symbol of France's liberation and rebirth. After the decisive victory near Orleans, Jeanne d'Arc's reputation and influence soared. But her mission was not limited to military successes alone. Jeanne's primary goal had always been to lead the Dauphin, Charles VII, to the city of Reims, to officially crown him King of France. This coronation held immense symbolic significance for the country, ultimately becoming even more important than military victories on the battlefield. Reims was the traditional site for the coronation of French monarchs. Ever since the time of Clovis, the first Frankish king, it was here that the anointing ceremonies for kingship took place. The French people believed that only a monarch crowned and anointed with holy chrism in Reims Cathedral possessed the true right to rule and received a special blessing from God. That is why Charles VII, who had not yet been crowned and held only the title of Dauphin, was perceived by many French people not as a fully legitimate monarch, but rather as a claimant who had not yet confirmed his authority over France. However, the path to Reims was extremely difficult. The city was located far in the northeast of France, in lands controlled by allies of the English, the Burgundians. Many of Charles VII's advisors considered this journey too risky and even impossible. But it was Jeanne who insisted on the necessity of an immediate campaign, convincing the king and his entourage that this was not merely a ceremony, but a crucial moment for unifying the country. Jeanne asserted that only after the coronation in Reims would the people definitively recognize Charles VII as the legitimate king and unite around him to fight the invaders. Her arguments were so convincing, and her prestige after the victory at Orleans so great, that the Dauphin Charles agreed to this risky step. On 29th of June, 1429, the French army, led by Jeanne, set out on the campaign known as the Loire Campaign. The army advanced rapidly northward, liberating important towns along the way, many of which surrendered practically without resistance, awestruck by Jeanne's reputation and popularity. Thanks to her presence, many local nobles and towns, previously fearing the consequences of openly opposing the English and Burgundians, openly switched to the side of Charles VII. Finally, on the 16th of July, 1429, the army reached Reims. The city, almost without resistance, opened its gates, inspired by Jeanne's fame and authority. The coronation of Charles VII took place the next day, the 17th of July, in the majestic Reims Cathedral, in the presence of numerous nobles, clergy, and common townspeople. This moment became a true triumph for all of France, symbolizing the long-awaited victory and the beginning of the country's revival. Jeanne, dressed in armor and standing beside the altar, held her famous banner, thereby emphasizing her role in this historic event. Jeanne's presence at the coronation held special significance. The peasant girl who never laid claim to personal glory stood as a symbol that the king had received his power by the will of God, and thanks to the feats of common people united in the struggle for their country's freedom. This coronation not only strengthened the authority of Charles VII, making him a fully fledged and recognized King of France, but also became a powerful symbol of the unification of the French people. Now, no one doubted that Charles was the sole legitimate monarch, and the English were invaders and usurpers. Thus, thanks to Jeanne's determination, fearlessness, and unwavering faith, the coronation of Charles VII in Reims became a turning point in the 100 Years' War, restored the legitimacy of royal power, and inspired the French to continue the fight for the liberation of their homeland from the English. From that day, Jeanne d'Arc became not just a national heroine, but a living symbol of a resurgent France. After the solemn coronation in Reims, which marked the pinnacle of Jeanne d'Arc's triumph, an unexpected turning point occurred. It would seem that the king should now have unconditionally trusted his savior and relied entirely on her authority and support. However, it was precisely after this victory that relations between Jeanne and Charles VII began to cool rapidly, gradually developing into estrangement. There were several reasons for this distancing. Firstly, after the coronation, Charles VII became much more self-assured. Now officially the legitimate King of France, he began to feel independent of Jeanne's influence. It seemed to many at court that Jeanne, a girl of lower-class origin, had gained too much influence over state affairs and the king himself. The courtiers themselves, high-born aristocrats and advisors accustomed to intrigue and political struggle, envied her popularity and feared her authority among the people and soldiers. Furthermore, after the victory at Orléans and the coronation in Reims, Jeanne insisted on continuing active operations against the English and Burgundians. She demanded an immediate continuation of the offensive, liberating Paris and other important cities. But at court, people emerged who advocated for a cautious and less aggressive tactic, believing that enough success had been achieved and it was now necessary to consolidate their gains, avoiding unnecessary risks. Charles VII, always cautious and prone to doubt, gradually leaned towards the position of the courtiers who believed Jeanne's influence had become excessive and even dangerous. Her inflexible will and straightforwardness began to irritate the king and his entourage. Eventually, the king ceased to actively support her military initiatives and began to listen more and more to the advice of those courtiers who considered Jeanne a dangerous figure capable of undermining their own influence. This distancing did not manifest immediately, but gradually became apparent to Jeanne herself. She was increasingly not invited to war councils. Her requests for new military actions were ignored or rejected, and the king began to avoid personal meetings. For Jeanne, who sincerely believed her mission was to liberate all of France, such treatment became a severe ordeal. An interesting historical factor is how the coronation ceremony of Charles VII in Reims itself took place, and what unusual rituals were used to confirm the new monarch's legitimacy. French tradition was closely linked to religious rites, and the coronation had profound spiritual meaning. Besides the classic rite of anointing with holy oil, brought from an ampulla said by legend to have been sent from heaven by an angel for the baptism of the first Christian king of the Franks, Clovis, there were other interesting rituals. One of the most unusual rites was a special symbolic act where several noble representatives of the clergy and nobility publicly confirmed before the people gathered in the cathedral that they recognized Charles as the legitimate monarch. These individuals addressed the people with special speeches and questions. Do you recognize this man as your lawful king? The people had to publicly give their approval and recognition, loudly shouting, "Yes, we recognize him." This ritual had immense symbolic significance, as it emphasized the unity of the people, clergy, and aristocracy in recognizing the monarch. Another interesting aspect of the ceremony was the tradition of presenting special symbolic regalia, such as the sword, spurs, crown, and scepter, which conveyed to the new king not only power, but also the responsibility to protect the people and the church. Charles VII received these attributes from the hands of the highest ecclesiastical hierarchs, signifying his obligation to defend France and the faith from all enemies. Thus, the coronation was a most powerful symbol of the unity of the people and their monarch. But despite this unity at the moment of triumph, the king's subsequent estrangement from Jeanne became one of the most dramatic episodes in her story, leading thereafter to the tragic end of her mission. After relations between Jeanne d'Arc and Charles VII began to deteriorate, she found herself in a difficult situation. Despite the king growing colder towards her, Jeanne had no intention of abandoning her mission. Her main goal still remained the complete liberation of France from the English and their allies. It was with this thought that she embarked on a military campaign to the north, into lands occupied by the troops of the Duke of Burgundy, an ally of the English. In the spring of 1430, Jeanne was in Compiègne, a strategically important town located on the Oise River. This town was a key defense point against the troops of the Duke of Burgundy and the English, who sought to reclaim their lost positions and halt the French offensive. On the 23rd of May, 1430, the fateful battle occurred that became a tragic turning point in Jeanne's destiny. On that day, Jeanne, along with a small detachment of soldiers, sortied from the fortress of Compiègne, attempting a surprise attack on Burgundian positions. The plan was simple: to deliver a swift and unexpected blow, demoralize the enemy, and drive them further from the city walls. But during this sortie, everything went wrong. The Burgundian soldiers proved to be better prepared and organized than expected. The French detachment, under Jeanne's command, encountered much stronger resistance and was forced to retreat back towards the gates of Compiègne. It was at this moment that a fatal error occurred. For an unclear and still disputed reason, the city gates suddenly closed just in front of Jeanne and her closest comrades. This prevented her from taking refuge inside the fortress and made escape from the pursuing enemies impossible. Jeanne and a small detachment of her supporters found themselves literally trapped between the closed gates and the pursuing Burgundians. The battle was brief but fierce. Despite desperate resistance, Jeanne was captured by a Burgundian soldier, an archer named Lionel of Vendôme. The question of why the gates of Compiègne were suddenly closed at the very moment Jeanne was returning is one of the most mysterious and controversial episodes in her biography. Some historians believe it was simply a fatal mistake or a misunderstanding caused by panic or lack of coordination among the city's defenders. Others, however, suggest that Jeanne may have fallen victim to a carefully planned trap set by her opponents, including French courtiers who wished to rid themselves of a figure who was too influential and inconvenient for them. These suspicions are reinforced by the fact that after Jeanne's capture, none of the French commanders made any serious attempts to free her or ransom her from captivity, although such opportunities existed. King Charles VII, in essence, stood aside, doing almost nothing for her rescue. This raised many questions and suspicions among contemporaries and historians. Thus, Jeanne's last battle near Compiègne remains a mysterious and ambiguous page in her life. Whether it was a tragic accident, a military blunder, or the result of deliberate betrayal, this question still has no definitive answer. Only one thing is clear. Jeanne's capture opened the door to the final, most tragic stage of her life, culminating in the sorrowful trial and execution that forever made her one of the most dramatic figures in world history. After Jeanne was captured beneath the walls of Compiègne, the French people and army expected an immediate reaction from King Charles VII and his entourage. It seemed obvious that the monarch should make every effort to free the heroine who had played a key role in his coronation and in saving France from complete catastrophe. However, the complete opposite followed. Charles VII and his close associates did almost nothing to save Jeanne from captivity. The main reason for this behavior lay in the complex political situation that had developed at the French court. After his coronation, Charles VII felt confident enough to listen to those courtiers who, from the very beginning, had perceived Jeanne as an obstacle and a threat to their influence. These people envied her popularity among the people and soldiers, considering her a dangerous figure capable of undermining their own positions at court, and even that of the king himself. They did everything to convince Charles VII that supporting Jeanne no longer made sense and was even dangerous, as it could lead to undesirable conflicts with England and Burgundy, with whom many at court dreamed of concluding a compromise peace. The role of Burgundy was particularly important. At that time, Duke Philip the Good, ruler of Burgundy, formally remained an ally of the English, but in reality, he pursued his own political and economic interests, skillfully maneuvering between the parties. When Jeanne fell into Burgundian captivity, the Duke quickly realized that he had acquired an invaluable tool for political bargaining. He knew how high Jeanne's symbolic value was for both the English and the French, so he decided to derive maximum benefit from it. The Burgundians put Jeanne up for sale as a valuable captive. The English were instantly interested in this opportunity. For them, Jeanne's capture was an incredible stroke of luck, as the girl, considered a symbol of French resistance, could not only be neutralized, but also used to discredit Charles VII himself. The English understood perfectly well that a public trial of Jeanne and her subsequent execution could deal a devastating blow to French national consciousness and the spirit of resistance. The deal between the English and the Burgundians was concluded fairly quickly. The English paid an enormous sum for Jeanne by the standards of the time, 10,000 tours livres. To understand the scale of this sum, it is worth noting that this money could have maintained a large military detachment for several months. Such a high price was explained not merely by the captive's military significance, but by her immense symbolic and political importance. Jeanne was a living symbol of French resistance. Her name was known in every French village, and her capture would have been a huge moral blow to the French. Having paid this price, the English transported Jeanne to Rouen, the center of their holdings in France, where she was to appear before an ecclesiastical court organized with the support of the English authorities. The main goal of this trial was to prove that Jeanne was a heretic and a sorceress, in order to destroy her reputation and thereby undermine the authority of the French king whom she had raised to the throne. Thus, the main reasons why no one rescued Jeanne were cynical court intrigues at the court of Charles VII, the king and his entourage's fear of complicating relations with Burgundy and England, and Burgundy's desire to sell such a valuable captive as profitably as possible. This deal and the subsequent trial of Jeanne became one of the darkest episodes of the 100 Years' War, forever casting a shadow on the reputation of King Charles VII and his entourage. After Jeanne d'Arc fell into English hands, she was taken to the city of Rouen, the center of English power in occupied French territories. There, she was to face a trial that went down in history as the Rouen trial. This event was one of the most shameful and cynical episodes of the 100 Years' War and became a stark example of how justice could be used for political ends. The Rouen trial began in January of 1431. The court was officially ecclesiastical, presided over by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a man closely associated with the English administration and entirely under its control. In reality, the entire process was a meticulously orchestrated performance, the main goal of which was not to establish the truth, but to discredit Jeanne as much as possible and declare her a heretic and a sorceress. Jeanne was accused of a whole range of crimes, the main one being heresy, that is, deviation from official church doctrine. Other important accusations included witchcraft, wearing men's clothing, which was considered a grave sin according to the ecclesiastical canons of the time, disobedience to church authorities, and falsely claiming to receive revelations from God. They tried to portray Jeanne as a dangerous witch, an instrument of the devil, who deliberately misled people and violated the sacred foundations of the church. Throughout the trial, the judges used numerous cunning tricks and insidious methods, trying to confuse Jeanne, to make her make a mistake or a statement that could be interpreted as an admission of guilt. For example, she was asked extremely complex theological questions, the answers to which were practically impossible for a simple, illiterate girl. Nevertheless, Jeanne astonished the judges with her clarity of thought, resilience, and ability to give simple and clear answers, avoiding the traps set for her. Another trick was the deliberate falsification or distortion of her words in the court records. Testimonies were recorded in Latin, a language Jeanne did not know, which allowed the judges to interpret her words in a light favorable to them. Moreover, Jeanne was denied defense, despite the fact that under ecclesiastical law, she was entitled to legal assistance and the counsel of a spiritual rabbi. One of the most insidious traps was related to the question of her men's clothing. Jeanne wore men's clothing for safety reasons, to avoid violence and harassment in prison conditions. But the judges deliberately used this fact as proof of her sinfulness and heresy, emphasizing that she intentionally violated church laws and refused to correct her behavior. Despite all these tricks and traps, Jeanne maintained herself with astonishing dignity and courage. She insisted that all her actions were directed exclusively towards the good of France and were carried out at God's command. However, realizing that the trial was not proceeding as smoothly as planned, the judges decided to use a final tactic: psychological pressure and the threat of death by burning at the stake. In the end, on the 24th of May, 1431, Jeanne was forced to sign a document in which she formally admitted guilt on some charges, promising no longer to wear men's clothing and not to claim she received instructions from God. However, a few days later, after she again had to wear men's clothing, possibly because she had no other, or she was deliberately deprived of women's clothing, the judges declared that she had violated her penance and relapsed into her former heresy. This allowed them to pass the final sentence, death at the stake. On the 30th of May, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was executed in the Old Market Square in Rouen. She died with dignity, continuing to insist on her innocence and repeating the name of Jesus until her last moment. Later, 25 years thereafter, this trial was officially declared illegal and unjust, and Jeanne was fully rehabilitated. But then, in 1431, her tragic death was the result of one of the most unjust and cynical trials in European history. After the judges found Jeanne guilty of repeatedly breaking the promises made at trial, they finally sentenced her to death by burning at the stake. Jeanne's last days became some of the most tragic and emotionally difficult moments of her life, but simultaneously the most vivid testimonies to her strength of spirit and human dignity. In these final days, she was held in solitary confinement in Rouen, under the strict supervision of English soldiers. Despite the harshest conditions of detention, constant psychological pressure, and the threat of imminent death, Jeanne demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage. Witnesses recall that she often prayed, spoke calmly with her guards and priests, never showed despair, and did not lose her clarity of thought. Before her execution, priests visited her, trying to persuade her once more to admit her guilt and thus save her soul. However, Jeanne refused any admissions that contradicted her true convictions. She insisted on her complete innocence and maintained that everything she had done was by God's command and for the good of France. Her demeanor before death astounded even many of her enemies and caused some judges and witnesses to feel shame and remorse. On the 30th of May, 1431, Jeanne was led out to the Old Market Square in Rouen, where a tall pyre had been erected. Despite the evident cruelty of the punishment, she ascended the place of execution with incredible calmness and dignity, repeatedly uttering the name of Jesus and calling upon him for help. Her last words were prayers and an appeal to God. This scene deeply impressed all eyewitnesses, among whom were not only her enemies and judges, but also common townspeople, many of whom wept, realizing the full injustice of what was happening. But why was Jeanne condemned specifically for heresy and not for political or military crimes? The fact is that the accusation of heresy was the most effective and convenient way to definitively eliminate her influence. Had Jeanne been tried simply for participation in military actions, she might have been perceived as a heroine and a martyr, inspiring the French to further resistance. However, an accusation of heresy meant that the Church itself recognized her as a criminal against God, which severely undermined her moral authority and automatically cast a shadow on the legitimacy of King Charles VII, whom she had brought to power. The decisive and formal pretext for passing the death sentence was the accusation of repeatedly wearing men's clothing. Although today this charge seems absurd and insignificant, in the 15th century, it was taken extremely seriously by the Church. Women wearing men's clothing was considered a violation of ecclesiastical order and a sin against natural laws. And after Jeanne was again found in men's attire, this served as the grounds for finally accusing her of heresy and relapsing into the sin she had supposedly already renounced. Thus, this formal accusation was used by the judges as the decisive argument for her condemnation and execution. In reality, the true reason lay not in clothing, nor even in religious matters, but in the political and symbolic significance of Jeanne herself, whose elimination became the goal of the English and their allies. The courageous behavior of Jeanne d'Arc before her execution, and the injustice of the verdict soon transformed her into a national heroine and martyr, whose death subsequently inspired the French people to final victory in the 100 Years' War, and left a profound mark on the history of France and all humanity forever. 25 years after the execution of Jeanne d'Arc in 1456, a new trial began, which went down in history as the rehabilitation trial. This judicial process was completely unusual and rare event for that time, as it completely annulled the verdict of the previously conducted ecclesiastical court. But why did the Church and the King of France, after so many years, decide to revisit the question of Jeanne's guilt or innocence? In reality, the decision to rehabilitate Jeanne d'Arc was primarily driven by political motives. By the mid-15th century, the political situation in France had changed radically. The 100 Years' War was drawing to a close. The English had been almost completely expelled from France, and the authority of King Charles VII had been significantly strengthened. Under these conditions, Jeanne no longer posed any threat to the French nobility and clergy. On the contrary, her heroic image could be advantageously used to bolster the king's authority and unite the French people. Moreover, the trial that condemned Jeanne had long been perceived by French society as unjust and politically motivated, and the girl's execution as a shameful page in the history of the Church and the monarchy. Many representatives of the clergy and secular authorities understood that Jeanne's condemnation had seriously damaged the reputation of the Church and the French crown. Rehabilitation would allow justice to be restored, remove the stain of disgrace from the Church's authority, and show that France had finally freed itself from the influence of English invaders and their supporters. The rehabilitation process itself was conducted very carefully and in detail. Dozens of witnesses were questioned, from common soldiers and residents of Orléans to high-ranking military commanders and priests. All of them confirmed Jeanne's honesty, piety, and exceptional merits. As a result, on the 7th of July, 1456, the ecclesiastical court in Rouen officially recognized that the previous trial of Jeanne had been illegal, and she herself was declared innocent of all charges brought against her. All materials from the previous trial were solemnly destroyed. After the rehabilitation, a new stage began in the history of Jeanne d'Arc's image. From a symbol of heresy and insubordination, she transformed into a national heroine of France, becoming the personification of courage, patriotism, and spiritual strength. Over time, her personality acquired truly legendary features, and her life and deeds became one of the main symbols of French history. In 1920, Jeanne was officially canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. An interesting fact is how the name of Jeanne d'Arc has been used for political purposes by different generations of French people over the centuries. In different eras, her image was adapted to completely different political views and interests. For example, during the French Revolution in the 18th century, Jeanne was depicted as a symbol of the common people's struggle against foreign interference and monarchical tyranny. In the Napoleonic era, she became an image inspiring the French to patriotism and unity in the face of external threats. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Jeanne was actively used by representatives of the most diverse political movements, from monarchists to republicans, from conservatives to socialists. During the First and Second World Wars, her name and image became important elements of French propaganda, symbolizing national unity and resistance to invaders. Even today, political parties and social movements in France often turn to the image of Jeanne d'Arc, emphasizing her as the embodiment of the values and ideas they wish to convey to society. Thus, the fate of Jeanne d'Arc, tragic and heroic at the same time, continues to exert an enormous influence on the consciousness of the French people and their national identity. Her rehabilitation, her subsequent transformation into a saint and national heroine, have forever secured Jean's place among the most outstanding and inspiring figures, not only in French, but also in world history.